Philadelphia has a reputation for being a poor big city. Why exactly and what now is being done about it? Today in Generosity Conversations. Hey there, I am Chris Wink. I am the CEO and co-founder of the company that publishes generosity.org and Tactically, two news organizations that cover professionals doing important work. Today, I'm joined by Michael Banks, who's the newly anointed executive director of an initiative called The Promise, which we'll discuss its work in a moment. Michael, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. So, The Promise, from the outset, some of our reporting, as I understand it, is at present with some city funding, some collaboration, is right now the Philadelphia region's largest and perhaps most collaborative anti-poverty effort. That's how I understand it from afar. I wonder if you can introduce me as you get settled in this seat. What
Yeah,
is The Promise as you see it?
sure. So the promise is really the result of the city's poverty action plan. Some time ago, there was an announcement, by Council President Clark to move 100,000 people out of poverty, and the promise is just that plan. Those remarks brought to fruition, right? We operationalized it. So it's a public-private partnership that we have with the city of Philadelphia, along with some other nonprofit partners, to hopefully meaningfully, reduce poverty in the city and move up to 100,000 people out of poverty by the year 2025 through several initiatives that we have launched at the United Way and other initiatives that are forthcoming.
Well prepped, Michael. I want to get into some of this, but one thing that for me and our newsroom, when we've talked about The Promise, something that rings true is you are, as I understand it, an employee of the United Way of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. The collaboration, The Promise, the United Way branding is not all over this. The Promise is a few stakeholders. Maybe talk to me a little bit about the intentionality of that. I've
Mhm.
reported on economic development efforts in Philadelphia for more than a decade. Uh, Poverty is political. I'm
Very.
curious about how intentional this work is, that The Promise is a shared brand as I see it from afar.
Yeah, so it's an interesting, setup, right? I look at it like you look at maybe a pharmaceutical company, right? We're within the house of brands of the United Way. So although we're under the umbrella of the United Way, there's different verticals within the organization that have a specific focus. When you look at the history of the United Way from our early days, all as a community within the community chest, right? It was all about putting money on the street, right? We were a mile wide and an inch deep. But what we're
Mm,
doing now under the leadership of Bill Goderer is changing that model and now becoming an inch wide but a mile deep. So this is
mm.
really a concentrated focus effort on trying to, again, meaningfully reduce poverty with a tool that we believe can be really impactful for the city and the residents of the city.
Mm. Let's turn to that in a moment,
Sure.
including the tactics you're hoping to deploy. I'm curious. I know some of this you and I have spoken in the past, but tell me a little bit about your personal connection to this work. Why is this work important to you?
Absolutely, Chris. So for me, being from the city and being impacted by poverty, it becomes personal, right? And it's one of those things that you let me tell a little story. It's funny. I didn't even realize I was in poverty until I went to middle school, right?
Mm.
And I was exposed to people with
Where'd you go to middle
various.
school? Where
I
did
went.
you actually grow up in Philly?
So I grew up in North Philadelphia first, around
Okay.
24th of Montgomery, then
Okay.
28th and Seaspeedmore Avenue. And I was bused out to a school called Russell H. Conwell, which is around the Kinston and Allegheny area. But that travel, you see different communities, you see various income levels, right? You get exposed to things that were not normal for you, right? So I was used to people coming to school a certain way. I was used to lunch being presented a certain way. It was a totally different environment for me. Then I began to say, well, there's something different here. People have access to things and I'm not even aware
Mm,
that you had access to it. So it began to make poverty real for me because when you don't have a different point of reference, right, it's easy to just accept something as being normal. But once you get out of that and you develop these new point of references, it changes the way that you view life. And so for me, it was one of those things like I know that there's a different life available. I was just trying to navigate how to get access to it. So when you see poverty, and I often say that, I experience the five senses of poverty, like the taste, smell, sense, everything
mm,
associated with it, there's it's true. And it was just one of those things where I'm like, this is not normal for people. This does not have to be a way of life. So I made it a personal mission, quite honestly, to try to align myself with solutions to learn more about it and hopefully, share some of the things that I've learned that helped me get out of poverty with others that are experiencing it. So for me, it was really personal, seeing your friends and family impacted by it, their inability to go to school and do basic things, Chris, that we take for granted, like go shopping at a supermarket, open up
Mhm.
a bank account, be able to afford a car and have car insurance, like things that, again, that if you're not from it, you think that everybody has access. You realize really quickly when you're in it or you get exposed to it, that lifestyle, the things that we take for granted, are not accessible to everyone.
Can you share any of those first senses? You mentioned the 5 senses of poverty.
Mhm.
Do you remember any of what are some of your earliest memories in middle school of understanding what poverty was?
So one of those senses is smell, right? Trash collection could be different depending
Mm.
on where you live in the city, right? And so your community smells different. It literally does. I will be on the 3 bus and you'll get off the 3 bus, another, like, something smells different here. Like, it's
Mm.
totally different, the things that you see. Because again, I think there's images of poverty that we see online, but it's also things that you see when you're growing up in those communities. You see the vacant buildings, you see the abandoned cars, you see the lack of a commercial corridor, you see plenty of check cashing places, you don't see banks, you don't see grocery stores. So all these things that exist in other communities, you go back to your community, like, why does not exist here? Why do the lights not work in my community? Why do
Mm.
the streets look the way that they do? Why does it just looks almost depressing somewhat when you compare it to what other people have access to and the other things that people see? And when you come back into your community, you know you're back in your community because you can feel it, you can smell it, you can sense it, you can touch it, and everything's different. Even the way that people interact with you, right? I noticed that when I would go into the pharmacy, I think it was like an Eckert's or something like that. I don't think they're around anymore. But the way that people would interact with me was
Mm.
different. It was totally different. So all those things, are things that, again, if you're not in it and you're not experiencing it, um, you may think that someone is making up a story when they share what their journey has been in poverty and the things that they experience. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that sometimes when you're in that environment, you have to go into other communities. It can almost become embarrassing for you because you feel like, I don't fit in. My clothes are not as nice as everybody else's clothes. My shoes have holes in it. Like, it's all these things that, again, that if you're not impacted and it's not your life, you wouldn't realize the trauma associated with being in poverty.
Is there one moment from an Eckerd or that trip to your middle school or anything? Does anything come to your mind about one moment when something clicked or your
Yeah,
journey changed?
yeah, I would say, what is some? I think one is when you're a kid, you get teased a lot when you're poor,
Mm.
right? Because your outfits, you have hand me down clothes, right? You're getting your clothes from the church, you're getting your clothes from wherever you have access to. You're not going to buy, new clothing. And I remember my mother, who did everything she could to, provide for us and to make our lives as amazing as it could be. And I remember she purchased these sneakers. There's only sneakers she could afford for us, and it was like these no name, like Chucks or something. They were Bobos, right? You know, the Bobos. And man, when I tell you, I did everything in my power to destroy those shoes so I would not be laughed at
Mm.
in them anymore. It was amazing. But it's things like that, like those noticeable differences that you don't think much of because everybody around you dresses the same way, looks the same way. But then you go to another school where folks maybe come from middle class backgrounds and upper middle class backgrounds, and they have Jordans, and you're walking around with Pro Wings on. You're like,
Mm.
oh, okay, there is a difference. The sneaker looks the same, but it's not received the same. So, like, things like that.
Mhm. That's powerful. Okay. And then you've been on quite your own personal journey. You are
Yes.
now leading the poorest big city's biggest anti-poverty initiative in the country.
Mhm.
I wonder how much the work that you and your team are hoping to do is grounded in how we got here. Do you have you put much thought into why exactly is Philadelphia the poorest of the big cities? There is a notable difference between 1 and
Yeah.
2 among the big cities.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors, right, Chris? I think one is you look at the history of the city. You think what happened during the 50s and the 60s, what we call white flight, the development of highways that the government put in place. People had access to homes that other folks that remain poor do not have access to, like the red line and all these different policies that were implemented, and then the loss of jobs here, right? You lose your manufacturing jobs, or the disconnect because you can't get to the job because of the transportation and not having access to a car. So there are a lot of factors that have contributed to the city of Philadelphia, being the largest big city. But I think when you look at the inability for someone to do something as basic as have access to housing, to own their own home, to begin to create equity for themselves, which is often one of the first wealth generation tools that a person has access to. Absent of those things, this is why this city looks the way that it does. So there are a lot of factors. I don't think you could point to one in particular, but this is just a collaboration of a lot of things that went wrong, and now we're in the process of trying to make a lot of those things right. And when the last thing I'll say, I think of it, oftentimes this way: like, how do you describe like darkness, right? What is darkness? It's the absence or the inability to act, that partial access to light. It's the same thing, right? It's all these other factors that have to be considered and have to be taken into account when you begin to solve what is poverty. It's really the absence of so many different things within several, a lot of communities, unfortunately, in this city.
This might back my way into the lines of questions I want to get to about the promise and what you're hoping to achieve. But to linger on that point for a moment, because I've had my fair share of interviews there, as you alluded to. There's a lot of both academic work and kind of armchair sociology, I suppose, on why Philadelphia is where it is. A couple components that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on. One argument around Philadelphia's relative rate of poverty is whether we're in the wrong category, meaning that number. We were going to 2019. We were making some progress on poverty. The pandemic has thrown that in across the country, and as we'll get to, in a lot of different strange ways. But we, yes, we are factually one of the country's biggest cities. We don't always act like it, but that is factually true. Mm-hmm. But we also could be categorized among other post-industrial cities, as you alluded to a moment. And when you look at what the other 10 biggest cities of the United States are now, outside of a New York or LA, most of them are southern, western. They're fast growing. They are younger. They have a very different. They're very different kinds of cities. And when you instead look at that Midwest or these Cleveland and Pittsburghs that are considerably smaller than Philadelphia, or you look at others like New Orleans and Baltimore's, our poverty rate starts looking much different, and our economic dynamism makes something very different. So I think a lot about what category we're supposed to be in. And I wonder, you leading the promise, do you think it's productive for us to look at ourselves as the poorest big city? Mm-hmm. Does it do us a service, I suppose, is what I'm really asking.
Well, maybe not a service, but definitely an awareness, right? And the reason I say that is that if you're not from Philadelphia and you come to visit the city, and most likely you're going to be in Center City, right? Somewhere that's where the tourists go, where you see the Liberty Bell, see all the amazing restaurants. And so you're not traveling maybe 2-3 miles outside of the location that you're in. And even if you're from here, you may be fortunate enough to be in a community that has higher income. So you're not aware of what your neighbors are going through in Southwest Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, and other parts of West Philadelphia, right? So it's this thing of making it top of mind for people that your lived experience is not everyone's lived experience, but it should be. And that's a problem. So I think it's important to highlight the fact that we have such a significant problem, in hopes that it becomes like a call to action or a rallying cry for the city. And I think that for those reasons, it's important to flag that and to own it, and to be aware that this is taking place in this city that I love. And I struggle sometimes, right? Because we are the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, right? But what love does not do is that's not my problem. It is my problem, because there's a human on the other side of this problem. And because I'm connected to them the same way I'm connected to myself, I'm committed to their life being, if not as good, similarly as good as my own. So for those reasons, I think it's important to make people aware that we still have this problem, and not get caught up in all the new towers going up in Center City, all the amazing restaurants popping up, all of the fancy things that sometimes we see on Broad Street, that if you go east and west, oftentimes of the very location that you're in, you see a totally different city of Philadelphia.
Well, I appreciate that distinction. One last perhaps quibble with how we understand our ranking as a poor big city before we get into some of the strategies you're deploying. Um, when you sit with those other big cities, when you make a nerdy spreadsheet and compare and contrast them as some of us perhaps have, um, what also becomes pretty quickly apparent is Philadelphia still remains relatively low cost to some of those other large cities, some of which, particularly in South and Southwest, um, has rapidly changed quickly. Um, and so, one of the criticisms that a lot of anti-poverty efforts get are we lifting people out of poverty or are we displacing people? Because obviously, one way to change a percentage of poverty in a city is to push anyone who's living in poverty through a higher cost of living to your regional fringe. And then suddenly your city demographics can look very differently. There's lots of global cities that get this criticism that suddenly over the aging of their city, poverty is once 100 years ago concentrated in center city in center city cores because there were manufacturing jobs, and then they've slowly been pushed outside of a center city core, and then the continuation of that is as cities get more and more desirable to live, that we further push out poverty, and oh look, our poverty rate went down because residents don't live here anymore. I will imagine that the promise will receive similar criticism of, are you going to solve people who are living in poverty, solve some of the challenges that people living in poverty are having, or will this be an economic development strategy that will over time displace people? And I wonder if you think much about is one reason that Philadelphia, one of the poorest big cities, because poor people can still live here, or does that come up at all? I suppose is my interest.
Yeah, that hasn't come up, at least to me. But what I will say is that if there's a strategy that we are adopting, it's definitely to make it better for the lives of the individuals here so they can remain here. There's been cities, as you're fully aware, that have just moved the poverty out, right? Put people on trains, have a nice day, figure it out on your own. And like, hey, look, 3 years later, we reduced our poverty, but you did not reduce it. You just displaced it. The promise is not to displace people. It's for people that want to remain here, to have the ability to do so, to put people on a path of home ownership, if that's what they desire to do, to make them aware of how to go about that particular process, right? So you can give them access to the resources and the tools needed for them to create their own wealth, and more importantly, be an owner of their own life, to make the decisions they need to make for themselves versus being stuck in a situation, because that's different. Remaining somewhere because you can't go anywhere else versus staying somewhere because it's where you want to be. We want to make it a place where people are remaining because it's where they want to be. The strategy is not to say, okay, here's a bus ticket, see you in another city. It's say, here's what we have right here locally for you. Here's these amazing partners and organizations committed to all these different things that we know are poverty alleviation tools, and we're going to help you better connect to those things. So then now you can make a choice when you get the better paying job, or you're able to create wealth. If Philadelphia is a place for you, you can remain here, do the things you need to do for yourself and your family, or if you desire to, you can leave the city, but you have more than one choice versus someone making a choice on your behalf. And I think for us, it has to be like humanity and person centric. It cannot be about trying to change a data point to make the city feel better by itself, and knowing that people are more hurt as a result of our actions, and we could have did something different.
Okay, then, well, the fine segue to turn into some of these strategies that you guys have at your disposal. There are decades of research of attempted efforts around anti-poverty. Populations change, tools change. I know you guys have done some considerable work on kind of a landscape analysis of what's happening around this country and elsewhere that has worked or might have promise. I wonder if you can start. What are you keen on? Is you early in this job? What strategies for you look like some of the first tools you hope to take on?
Yeah, so some of the things that we've done, early on, and we still have some of the data for Corman, and some of the things that are actually on the website. We focus on family stability, right? And that's a really, really loaded word, right? But what it really means is, how do you create access to these fundamental things that an individual needs to have a certain quality of life? That's what means: access to housing, access to food security, right? Access to make things like free tax preparation, or information that exists out there that there's tax dollars allocated towards, that the individuals oftentimes in the community that I alluded to earlier are completely unaware even exists, right? So there's this disconnected ecosystem that exists for a lot of these resources and tools that we're trying to help people get better connected to, through different partnerships that we have within the community. So this is not something that exists in United Way at 1800 JFK. No, this is something that was driven by United Way or powered by the United Way, but it really lives inside of the communities where the individual lives. And in addition to that, the work that I was doing prior to this with regards to the promise is on this record clearing initiative. Because here in the city of Philadelphia, there's upwards of 400,000 people that have been impacted by either an arrest, a conviction. And so what we're going to do, in the spring is do over 30 clinics throughout the city, on multiple days. I think each organization is going to do at least 2 clinics in these communities to give people access to these resources, again, where they live. So we're not forcing them to come into Center City. We're working with the community, working with the community partners, set up the clinics right there to make them easily accessible so that person can find out, if I have a record, how do I get it cleared, expunged? What are the steps I need to take to get myself to get back into the workforce? In addition to that, we're going to have the workforce partners there on the ground, in addition to our education partners, so that we're not just serving a segment of the community, but we're serving the whole community. Because although there may be 400,000 people impacted with an arrest record or something along those lines, there's other individuals greater than the 400,000 that are still looking for quality work, that are still looking for an opportunity to go back to school. So we want to bring all those things into the community and hopefully, have a long-term commitment to do this thing year over year, because this is not a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year soft, Chris. This is probably going to take upwards of 10 plus years for us to really start to create something that's sustainable, right? It can't be an in and out thing, because poverty it wasn't not an in and out thing. We have poverty because of a lack of investments for a very long time. So in order to reverse poverty, you have to reverse engineer how you created the problem. And that's what we're trying to do.
I want to pick up on that. I just should know, for those who are watching live, I do take and see comments coming in. So Sabrina, I appreciate that, and a couple others that I'm getting in DMs. Some of what I hear early on in conversation, Michael, and you touch on it, is, I said a moment ago how political poverty is. It's polarizing, and even when a relatively staid research comes in this area, that it all ends up having this like bit of tinge. Like even when you mention family stability, that's a tripwire word for lots of folks about what coded language that reads, which is why these poverty initiatives are so challenging. I would think, I haven't done the level of research that I would hope and imagine some of you and your colleagues have done. I would imagine there's a degree of research familiarity with being able to estimate what programs can have what impact in communities, given that these have been done time and time again. You mentioned the record clearing work. Essentially, the logic there is giving people a better opportunity to get into jobs that are already in Philadelphia. And you mentioned tax prep. I hope we'll get to that in a moment. There's like a lot of conversations. I spent a year answering calls at the Philadelphia Coalition Against Hunger, shout out. And one of the dominant theories was just, can we just get more Philadelphians to get comfortable with the programs that already exist? Change nothing. Can we just increase uptake? I guess I'm wondering, at this point in your tenure, do you guys have that spreadsheet or vision board that is, hey, here are the policies we have that we think will be able to move this number of people in and out of poverty, and this is why we are prioritizing what policy when we do?
So here's how I would answer that question. I would say that the policy is being developed. I think there's a lot of learning that we're going through right now, because again, this is the first time we've done something similar to this that will influence some of the advocacy and policy that you will see forthcoming. But we don't want to come out of the gate and say, here's what we believe to be true, without being able to point back to something that says, and here's why we believe that, right? I think that's a critical thing. It's like, it's easy to assess a problem without being in it, without being engaged, without touching it, and say, I understand what's going on. You just need to do X. We don't want to take that approach. We want to spend time, again, within the community, talk to the people on the ground, learning as we go, and say, okay, from over the last year, here's what we learned differently than we assumed going in the front end, and here's the policy that we want to push for. But in addition to that, I do think that there's also some things that already exist that we know can be better for individuals, but it's just a matter of getting someone to care deeply enough about it to say, okay, let's take the next step and try to find a way to get this enacted so that the city of Philadelphia and its inhabitants are no longer dealing with some of these, particular issues. Again, I think the easy solve is things like affordable housing, right? We do not need to do a deep research analysis to understand the role of home ownership and affordable housing for a person to get out of poverty and to remain out of poverty. You don't need an analysis for that, right? But there are things that we do need an analysis for, like, okay, well, if a person has a record, how long does it take to get cleared? What would their life look like after 6 months, after 12 months, after a year? And what is a policy that we need to accelerate that? Because is it something systemic? Is it that we can do all this great work, but then we hand it off to the next stage? The next stage is unable to handle that particular capacity. So those are the things that we're learning. But again, there's some things that we do know to be true that we have been pushing for and we'll continue to push for. And I think this work is going to continue to highlight the need for us to find a policy that makes sense to get people, and to get people out and to remain out of poverty.
I don't want to lose this thread on local initiatives, but just in thinking about efforts to use what existing resources have there already there and what we've learned, when you look at the anti-poverty literature and research, particularly at a municipal level, almost always there is a conversation around a relationship to the federal government. One major change of the last 50 years in the United States is how many of these initiatives have continually been put at the municipal level, and that how federal government funding happens has changed. Earned income tax credit are some exceptions that have had bipartisan support, but on the whole, municipalities have had to do a lot of this work on their own. Mm-hmm. Over the last 2 years, we've had a remarkable and historic change, turnover, case study, I suppose, with a flood of federal stimulus funding that has come through to local municipalities through two different presidential administrations from two different political parties. This has been historic and changed quite a bit. One of those big examples is the extended child care tax credit that had one of the most direct and immediate impacts on poverty of any initiative that I know about. That is so far from where you are able to sit. Mm-hmm. I wonder how much the investments of the federal government are in the purview of your work. Is that just seen as such an entirely different animal that what happens there will naturally impact our work, but we can't touch it? Or is that itself one of those strategies that you think you should be thinking about?
Yeah. So I think that it's one of those strategies that you have to consider, right, for something to be sustainable and to really have like a larger impact, right? And I'm glad you mentioned, the extension of the child care tax credit, right? Because what we learned is that oftentimes it takes something like beyond our imagination for people to often get off the sideline and say, we need to do something differently because what we're doing right now is not working, to be innovative, right? And it's terrible that it took a pandemic for us to think differently about how we resolve certain things and do certain things. But what we learned in that process is that when you are innovative and we are able to implement different solutions than what you may have done historically, particularly at the federal level, it has a much bigger impact than we could ever have, locally. Because again, you know how the dollars flow federal, state, and then what's left over go to the local markets. So I think the more awareness that we can create for this, and the more we could point back to the impact that those programs like that have had, and the more people we can make people educated and informed, and to get them to say, hey, this is what we want locally, then at the state level and at the federal level, and when people are voting that think about these type of things, that's the only way, in my opinion, that something like this becomes sustainable. Because if people are not accountable, and if you allow them to do the same things that they have been doing historically, the story remains the same. But I do think there is an opportunity for us to learn from what we've been going through the past 2 years, to find better tools and ways to resolve a lot of our social ills, such as poverty.
Any place that is confronted poverty for as long as Philadelphia has will remain a very sharp elbowed place. That there are many different efforts. I know, watching this now or perhaps in the future, there will be people who will have in social services organizations and economic development groups, in other collaborations, will say, hey, we've done things like this before. What is the promise saying that we want to do differently? Is it the centralizing these efforts? I wonder what you think of, or you hope to be, the differentiation about how the promise will approach alleviating poverty in Philadelphia.
It's another one of those trippy words, right? You empower the community, right? And for empowering for us, what that means is bringing them to the decision-making table. Don't make a decision on their behalf just solely based upon academic research, and think that you don't there's not a need to bring the community to the table to ask them about the solutions that you're looking to implement. Because, I was talking to, I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, and I feel terrible about that. But he was saying that, how do you say it, that solutions move at the speed of trust or something along those lines. And it's so
Mm-hmm.
true.
Mm-hmm.
If we do not have the trust of the community and they don't believe in the work that we're doing, this does not work. It doesn't work. It don't matter how much money you throw at it. If the community is not a part of it and you don't get the buy-in from them and they're not a part of the solution implementation, we fall short. So for us, it's community centric. It's talking to folks that have doing this work for a very long time, that have oftentimes have been under resourced, right? Learning from them, working alongside them, saying, okay, let's figure this out collaboratively, not just United Way want to come in and we want to be the white savior. No, we want to do that. We don't want to come into your community and tell you what you need. We want you at the table with us and helping us think about how to implement an equitable solution that the community trusts, believes in, and can get behind.
Mm. The a It's worthy to give the promise some credit in my estimation that you have put some specific numbers to this. This is a frequent criticism of their anti-poverty efforts that they just say we're working on it. This does have some numbers tied to it. 100,000 people by 2025. I think somewhat those are good, nice round numbers, and I don't fault anyone for using numbers for that kind of organizing principle.
Mm-hmm.
In part, I also think this, in my understanding, will, if accomplished, the bet is we will have reduced poverty faster than other peer cities in our open estimation. And so we'll perhaps finally no longer be the poorest of the 10 biggest cities. I believe Houston is number 9 in that ignominious distinction. How important and how seriously do you take those numbers? 100,000 by 2025. Is that something that pulses through your mind daily?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, like it's a really big number. But the way that I approach it, right, it's like you can set a goal. So I think there's a difference between the goal and your capacity, right? So you can say we can get to 10,000, right? My hands on the opposite side here. But this is all the capacity you had. So you got to 10,000 and you missed it. But let's just say this top number is 100,000, but you kept it at 100,000. Let's say we got to 70,000, 80,000. We've covered an additional amount of capacity that we would not have done if we would have set the bar too low at 10,000. It should be something that makes us uncomfortable. It should be something that gets people excited. It should be something that is something that we can align everyone around to say, and this is how we get there collectively, right? I think that there's a danger in setting the bar too low, and I think that has plagued this city and other cities, unfortunately, too often, right? We set such a low standard, and we celebrate it. Like we moved it, 5,000 people out. That's not worth celebrating, right? Because it's still over 300,000, almost 400,000 people still experiencing that. So I think that it's really important to have, these numbers that scare you, that make people criticize you and people pay attention, because it creates an accountability, and it makes us have to show up in a certain way that we're really committed to moving 100,000 people out. So even if technically we don't get you 100,000, we got to 80,000. That 80,000 is a lot better than that 10,000 that we started, that we could have set in the very beginning. So we love the big audacious goal. We love the thing that scares us. So
noted, but now I feel like I can't not ask. Do you think the promise can move 100,000 people out of poverty by 2025?
By 2025, if we're not moving 100,000 people out, here's what I will say: we're close. Right? I think there's some factors outside of our control, right? That we just can't, factor in, how many people actually show up to the clinics. Are people actually coming to the tax sites, right? It doesn't matter how great the solution is if people are not showing up, or you're unable to connect to the individuals that need those resources the most. So I think there's a big emphasis that we've placed on connecting to the community to make that number realistic. And because we've done a lot of things on the front end, I think it increases the probability to get to 100,000 a lot more than it would have been if we would have taken a different approach with that particular number and an initiative.
Not to get too weedy on numbers, but again, I think clarity of goal is worth the scrutiny because it's important. It stuck out to me when I saw the rollout of this program that it wasn't tied to like we're going to reduce a poverty rate by a certain percentage, because as noted, that can be done by a lot of different ways. The population growth, of hiring commanders. There's lots of different ways that you can change a percentage. It's critical that you guys put this as a 100,000 number. Just curious, and actually I see a couple other good comments coming in, Wes and others. I see those, and thanks. I'll note that. But do you picture this as we hope to chart individual people's journey, or is this like at a data centric level, we want to see the number of people who live in poverty in 2025 is 100,000 less? Do you follow me? Does that quite make sense?
Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, what we have been doing is trying to find ways to better measure the individual's journey, right? We want to make sure that when people know that they're engaging with us, that we're committed to their success. So it's not just come to one clinic and we forget about you, but we've been working on the different tools internally to make sure we're able to measure how successful we're being able to track the journey of individuals and learn from them and say, okay, well, here's what we assumed on the front end. Here's a barrier that maybe we did not consider that we want to take into consideration so that we can improve the outcomes over time. So I really think that it really starts with having this relationship with the individual for us to really do this the right way.
I want to actually pull up a comment from one of the folks watching right now, Wes. I think puts out a challenge that I suspect is one of the key challenges that you as a community organizer have. Let me see if I can throw this up. Yeah, so this is Wes. Thanks, and others who are watching live. I can pull up comments on this works out. He makes a natural point, and I have to feel like this comes up with you a lot of like, hey, why is your standard out of poverty at all? Like, I don't know the numbers offhand, but family of four, I think usually poverty level is 26,000 or so in income. If you're below that, the federal government considers you in living in poverty. There's also a metric of deep poverty, which is another matter. I think some of what Wes is getting at is, why is this the number? Why is 100,000 people getting out of poverty? Why is this the metric that the Promise has chosen as its priority?
Well,
thanks for that, Wes, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wasn't there in the origination of the 100,000, but what I can speak to is what I know to be true now. I think that you have to have a starting point. You have to have something to measure towards, right? If we were to do this and we try to solve every factor on the front end, I think we're dead on arrival. I think you got to look for ways to get some early wins that you could continue to build on. But I wouldn't be surprised that, like to Wes's point, that we don't look at other factors, right? We don't just like move them out. How do you keep them out? But for me, you have to start somewhere. You have to have a goal that's somewhat attainable, or at least feels attainable, that you begin to work towards. Because absent of that, we won't accomplish anything. So I think that there has to be something that you say, here's something that we think we can do, and then we can hopefully build on the success of being able to do that, to do some other things to make this a lot more sustainable and to keep people out of poverty. Because it's right, you can do some things like, oh, we raise it up $1 and do what others say, but that doesn't necessarily keep the individual out of poverty. But I think the things that we're looking at, such as, again, housing stability, I keep going back to that because that is such an important tool, right? So that's more than increasing a person's daily wage or how much they earn, but now you're putting a person in the ability where they can now begin to create wealth for themselves and begin to build equity for themselves and their families. So it's not just about, let's just increase the salaries of the individuals, but there are other factors that contribute to poverty that we not necessarily have control over, but we have access to some of the solutions that can make their lives a lot better and hopefully put them in a position where they can, again, create this wealth for themselves, get out of poverty, remain out of poverty. And that's the things that we're kind of focused on right now, Chris.
I lose you in a few minutes, so let's hit a few topics. I think another a thematic challenge that anyone in the work that you're doing confronts is you are having to choose priorities. That just is the reality, that there are folks. We have done ample reporting on folks that will have a strategy that this is a story of Philadelphia lacking jobs, that this story has to be economic and economic first. There are folks who think, like, what are we leaving on the table in terms of engagement with federal government or existing programs and resources? There are folks who there's any number of strategies in which people will say this is square one, and you have the unenviable or the important task of I have to then say this is where we are going. This is where this team is saying priority one. You've hit on a few kind of record clearing, tax prep, other strategies that have been around that have said, we need to get people the ability to get into existing jobs. We need to get people to access additional resources. I wonder if there's others that are top of mind for you in terms of strategies that you think, if you made that strategy or that spreadsheet, like, here's how I'm going to move 100,000 people out of poverty. These are the tools I think are going to get me there, or are going to have the biggest impact on the most people I can in the short period of time I have. Are there other examples, or are there ways that you think those existing strategies can be supercharged, I suppose, for a better example? Because essentially we have to outpace other cities
Absolutely.
if we're going to do
Yeah.
this work.
So here's how I would answer that one. I think for me, there's not one thing that I can point to say, here's the next thing, here's the next thing. But what I do believe is that there has to be an emphasis on experimentation, right? You can look at what they were able to do in New York. They didn't get every program right. I think they launched 40 to 60 programs, something like that. Some of them they stopped doing. But without taking an approach that, hey, we're just going to try several different things and we're going to learn as we go what is the most impactful, the things that we can continue to scale up, the things that we know are solving the problem, and then we're going to discontinue to do the other things. And I don't think that's an approach that we have taken in the past. It's like, here's the 3 things that we think they're true, the 5 things, the 10 things we think to be true, we're going to do those things only. And now we're trying to think a little bit out of the box. So there may be things that I'm not even thinking about. And this is the importance of it not just being the decision of the United Way or the decision of Mike Banks, but also the decision of the community. Because when we learn from the community and say, okay, here's something that we never even thought about, like maybe it's a stipend, maybe it's a connection to transportation that was not top of mind for us, but it's top of mind for the individuals who are living through this poverty situation. And they're saying, and here's the things that impact my ability to get out of poverty, right? So I think that we have to experiment. We have to be willing to make some big bets. And we, more importantly, Chris, we have to be willing to fail, right? We're not going to, poverty, so this is interesting for me. When we talk about poverty and things like that, we want people to bat 1,000%, or it doesn't work that way. We have to be willing to say, okay, we're going to go 1 for 10, but we learn so much from that one that it becomes scalable, that we no longer have to do the other 9 things in the future. But without a willingness to fail, without a willingness to experiment, without a willingness to say, we've never done this before, but we're going to try it, this doesn't work. So that's our approach, is let's experiment.
Well, and I think that I appreciate that. I would imagine the push of the challenge you get is Philadelphia's not alone in addressing housing affordability, economic opportunity, skills-based training, tax prep, record expungement. Like, these things are around the country, at the least, are confronting. So there has been a degree of experimentation. That would be some pushback, that having the experiments already happened, and now isn't the promise meant to marshal resources and say, we are now moving forward what we do know?
Yeah, I think you can take both sides there, right? I think that there's some truth in that, and there's some truth in what I'm sharing, right? And what I mean by that is, just because it works somewhere else doesn't mean it's going to work here. And I think that's another problem that we have in the city. We want to adopt everything that everybody does the exact same way and hope that it works. I could say that from my learnings from this entrepreneurship work. We went to the city of Detroit and seen exactly how they did it, but trying to do that here, totally different. Totally. So you can't just import the solution. I think you can learn from what other folks are doing and try to maybe implement it differently. But it's also, there's some tangibles I think that have to be done differently for this particular city that are not always present on the surface. Like, what is the role of philanthropy, right? What is the tax rate? There's all these other things that that oftentimes are not a part of that conversation, and we just fall in love with a solution somewhere else. Say, we're going to do the exact same thing here. And that's not always the case, because again, there's the things that, like they talk about in your job, that your hard skills and your soft skills. There's the things that you have not considered, right? Like, what is the transportation system? How often do the buses run? What does the business corridor look like? What does the educational system look like that the individual has access to? So then there's a lot of factors that have taken place in other places that are not necessarily true here, which is why for us, we have to be willing to do some experiments and not assume that because it worked in another city that it's going to work. I think we can learn from them, but I think it's a danger in saying we're going to do it the exact same way without being mindful of the inhabitants of this particular city.
I think I get like one more question or so with you. Before I do that, I'm going to squeeze in one. Just, we got another comment, actually, friend of the show, Sabrina. I mean, this is a long comment from her, but I think she's hitting on the theme you just got to, which is, here's what I think you end up being challenged by. Sabrina's basically saying here of like, yes, when we talk to people's journeys in poverty, there are so many intertwined factors. It's access to childcare. It is, Sabrina's pointing out, it is, you can do the jobs training, but if Philadelphia has been a relatively slow growth economic engine, we've watched the collapse of middle wage jobs across the country, but Philadelphia more than other peer cities, Philadelphia is famously both poor and not wealthy. So we tend to not also have as many fast growth opportunities for income growth. I'll note from actually some technically reporting that we do know that Philadelphia has had relatively consistent economic growth, but it's been on the slower side. So I think that to translate for my purposes, what Sabrina's getting at here is, do you think you can unwind these many intertwined factors and reach this number with strategies that are in your control, knowing that so much is, are we going to have a recession in 2023? Is it going to thrust way more people in poverty? Is there going to be another age of stimulus that could radically change or not change? There's so many factors that you have no control over, Michael. Do you think you have the tools that are in your control to hit this number?
I would say we don't have all the tools. We have some of the tools. And the way that I like to answer, remarks or questions like that is like, here's one thing we know to be true, Chris. If we do nothing, nothing gets better. Everything remains the same. In fact, it gets worse. This at least gives us a chance and an opportunity to unwind and to better understand what's taking place. And that's what this is. This is our moonshot. This is us saying, hey, we want to give our best effort to try to move people out of poverty. And it may not be the most popular thing or the thing that everybody gets behind, but we're willing to try something, because what we're not willing to do is nothing, right? To let things remain the same way that they are, and hope that things get better. And I want to pick up on the latter part of something we said. If I remember the question correctly, she was talking about a person being incarcerated and going through training and all that stuff is great. And that's part of the problem, right? Again, with this adopting what everybody else does. When we adopted this train and pray model. But what we're trying to do, even with some of the clinics that I alluded to earlier with regards to the record clearance, is bring the workforce partners into the clinic, into the places where the people are going to be, and with the understanding that before they come here, that these are the type of candidates that they're looking to hire and give an opportunity to. I think absent of that, we run into the same problem that we had before. I got my record cleared, or I got the certification, but for what? I got this college degree, same thing there, but for what? I got this specialized skills, but for what? It has to be connected to an opportunity. So what we have tried to do is, again, bring those opportunities into the room so that person doesn't leave the clinic and now they're on their own trying to find their next, employment opportunities. But the employer is meeting them there on site at the same spot that as they work through the record clearance, there's almost like this promissory note, if you would, like, if you do these things, here's what's waiting for you. And that's the commitment that we've got from some of the workforce partners that are agreeing to show up for us. But again, we have to do something. It can't be, let's just watch this thing go by and let's try to forecast if there's a recession or some other thing that's outside of control that keeps us from doing something. This city can't wait. The people can't wait. I'm not sure how many people drive through North Philadelphia, how many people drive through West Philadelphia, Southwest Philadelphia, and look at the people. And it would be hard to look at what people are going through and say, you know what, because we haven't figured it out, let's do absolutely nothing. We can't do that. The community can't tolerate that anymore. So we're just trying our best. And what we're hoping is that people rally around the work that we're trying to do, the community rally around it, and that we're that as a city, we combine our resources and our efforts to move, because United Way can't do this alone. Like, we can have all this great strategies, right? But we need other folks working alongside us, helping us get the word out, people showing up to the clinics. All these things have to take place for this to be successful. Once again, we have to do something.
This is, in my mind, one of the most important conversations in the country, certainly in the city of Philadelphia. So I appreciate you having the time to have it out with me. If in a year we get back together, which I surely hope we will, because you're just a month into the role.
I'm not even a month. I'm about to say I'm like
right.
3 weeks in.
All right, 3 weeks in. Well, welcome to it. When we get to have a conversation again in a year, which at that point I will note, because I think the promise it begins its promise in 2020. So we'll be almost halfway through this work or so in a year from now. Maybe in a year from now, when we get to have a conversation, what do you hope to have done by then for us to be able to talk about?
Man, I have a lot of hopes, Chris. Let's just start with that. But one of my hopes is that people are aware of what's available to them, right? These resources that exist that are oftentimes literally right outside of the community or within the community, and there's this no awareness. There's no one making people know that here's someone right in your community that offers you free tax preparation. Here's this organization right here in your community that puts you on a path to home ownership. Like that a lot of the resources that we're trying our best to illuminate no longer need to push that we've been doing to make people aware, but people are now more mindful or more aware, and we can see like the trajectory of growth. Like, okay, we're at 25,000 now. People literally on the cusp of getting out of poverty. Like we have that measurement, and we could begin to forecast what it will look like if we continue down this path over the next 3 years, next 5 years. So for me, I think those are the things that I wanted to be able to say, here's the impact that we've made today. And here's what the community is aware that they have access to the resources that are within their community that they should not have to beg for or ask for, but people are making sure that they have access to and they're being able to utilize on for themselves.
Michael, I so appreciate your time. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Absolutely, Chris, and thank you for having me.
We'll talk soon. Everyone, thanks for watching live. If you are watching the post, we'll put the link to the recap for you to get a full debrief, and we will be sure to be following along the work of the Promise and Michael Banks. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.